Today's lesson is Have you experienced the Google effect? Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to talk about something called the Google effect. What the heck is that? We're going to find out. I know what Google is. Of course, that is a very popular search engine online. If you're looking for information, most people use Google. There are other search engines out there, but you can probably use Google more often. At least most people probably use Google. But we've got this interesting phenomenon called the Google effect. What the heck is that?
Well, that question is going to be answered in the text in our discussion. But to start off, we can just look at one phenomenon, one happening, which is the fact that a lot of people who were born before computers were invented or things like Google and other search engines were around were able to remember telephone numbers. So when I was a kid, I was able to remember 20, 30 telephone numbers of the people that I had to call often. Today, I can't recall one telephone number. Not even my own, actually, sometimes.
Really? Well, I know my own phone number and my wife's phone number, but yeah, my daughter's phone number, it's in the phone. I just tap on her name there on the screen and that'll call her. I don't really need to know the number. And that's kind of what the Google effect is all about. All this information is online, so we don't really need to memorize things anymore, like phone numbers or addresses and things like that. And we'll talk some more about this as our lesson continues. So let's get into it now. Let's listen to the first part. It's kind of long, so pay special attention.
Have you experienced the Google effect? Have you ever tried to recall a piece of information you read online, only to realize you've forgotten everything but the name of the website? If so, then you've experienced the phenomenon known as the Google effect. The term, which derives from a study conducted in 2011, describes our tendency to forget information that can be easily accessed online. As we increasingly rely on the internet for information, we are likely to experience this kind of forgetfulness more and more often. But is this digital amnesia really a significant cause for concern?
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 derive， 这个字是动词，指来自、起源于或是从点点点中获得。例如 Many different medicines are derived from plants. 许多不同的药品是源自于植物。或是 This story derives from a popular folktale. 这个故事源自于一个广为流传的民间传说。另外补充这个字的同义词 originate, O-R-I-G-I-N-A-T-E, originate, 意思是发源或是起源于。我们可以说 The river by our cabin originates from up in the mountains. 我们小屋旁的那条河源头来自那山上。也可以说 Researchers are trying to find out where the virus originated from. 研究人员正试图找出这个病毒是源自于哪里。接着我们看到名词 tendency， 指思想或是行为等的倾向、趋势。例如 Stuart has the tendency to say the first thing that comes to his mind. Stuart 常常想到什么就说什么。或是 Carrie has a tendency to chew with his mouth open. Carrie 习惯咀嚼食物时把嘴巴张开。另外把这个字字尾的 E-N-C-Y 去掉，就变成了单字 tend。这个字是动词，意思是倾向或是易于。我们可以说 This cafe tends to get busy in the afternoon. 这间咖啡简餐店在下午生意经常很好。也可以说 The MRT tends to get crowded at around 6 o'clock. 捷运在6点左右往往会变得拥挤。
So to begin with the first part of today's discussion, the first sentence says, have you ever tried to recall a piece of information you read online only to realize you've forgotten everything but the name of the website. So here we have a question, and this question is basically to describe a situation. So you're trying to remember a piece of information that you read on a website, on the internet, but then you realize you don't remember it. You have forgotten everything except for the name of the website. Has that ever happened to you?
It has happened to me, of course, so we're asking this question as a way to begin the essay, and you can answer this question if you want to. Yeah, have you ever tried to recall or remember a piece of information, like someone's phone number or how to write a certain Chinese character, and then, of course, you may have forgotten those things, or how to spell the word anti-disestablishmentarianism. Gee, I forgot how to spell that word, but maybe you'll be able to figure out how to spell that word by going online someplace and looking it up. That's a lot easier than memorizing it.
Yes, so if you have had this problem before, then you've experienced the phenomenon known as the Google effect. The term, which derives from a study conducted in 2011, describes our tendency to forget information that can be easily accessed online. So the Google effect derives from a study. To derive means to come or originate from. So Google effect originates from a study conducted in 2011, and it describes our tendency to forget information. A tendency is, in this context, an aspect of our character that makes us behave in a certain way. So I could also say, for instance, there is a growing tendency among people who use smartphones to fall asleep with their earbuds in their ears.
Oh, no.
Yes, that's true.
Right, and of course, if you fall asleep with your earbuds in your ears, well, that could be a bad thing. You won't hear any fire alarms if there's a fire or something like that. So my goodness, you better not fall asleep with those earbuds in your ears. And yes, tendency means you have the inclination to do something. I know a guy named Leo, and he has a tendency to be late all the time. So we always tell him to meet us a half hour earlier. We don't tell him that's early. And then, of course, he'll show up on time. But then he quickly figures out what we're doing. And then he continues to arrive a half hour late after that. But in this particular case, the Google effect describes our tendency to forget information because we know we can find it easily online. And as we increasingly rely on the internet for information, we are likely to experience this kind of forgetfulness more and more often. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I suppose it's okay if you do that as long as we have internet access. But if we don't, if someone drops a neutron bomb somewhere and wipes out all of our telecommunications networks, then yeah, we're going to have to remember people's phone numbers and stuff like that, or their addresses and things like that. But yes, indeed, we rely on the internet for information, which means we depend on it. We know the information is there, and it's like a good friend to us because we always know we can swipe our phones and get that information instantly.
Yes, and the rest of this article basically asks the question whether the Google effect is necessarily a bad thing. So the next sentence says, but is this digital amnesia really a significant cause for concern? So digital amnesia is another way to refer to the Google effect. Amnesia here is a medical condition that makes you unable to remember things. And this happens a lot to people who have had accidents that have hurt their head or affected their brain. But here we're talking about digital amnesia, which is amnesia or forgetfulness that is caused by the use of computers or Google or search engines.
Yep, so if you're forgetful, of course, you forget things all the time. Gee, what did I do with my keys? Where did I put them? Yeah, what's my neighbor's name? I forgot. So yes, you are forgetful. And of course, the noun form is forgetfulness. And yes, we're talking about digital amnesia, just not remembering things like phone numbers because we know we can find them online. But yeah, is that a problem? Is it a cause for concern? Should we be worried? Let's find out by listening to the next part right now.
Once, when asked what the speed of sound was, the great physicist Albert Einstein replied that he never memorized such information because it was readily available in textbooks. Indeed, remembering facts is seldom the most efficient use of memory. If information is stored somewhere easily accessible, creating a memory of how to access it is far more efficient than memorizing the information itself. Today, the internet is the ultimate source of information, and thanks to search engines, it is extraordinarily simple to navigate. It makes sense, therefore, that when we read something useful online, our brains tend to create the most efficient kind of memory about it, not what it was, but how to access it.
最后我们看到动词 navigate 指浏览或是访问网站。举例来说 Tablet users navigate the device using a touch interface. 平板电脑的使用者利用触控界面来浏览这种装置。也可以说 Nelson used his tablet PC to navigate to that website. Nelson 用他的个人电脑访问那个网站。
Once, when asked what the speed of sound was, the great physicist Albert Einstein replied that he never memorized such information because it was readily available in textbooks. So this tells us that such a situation as the Google effect existed before Google was even invented, because we have an example of Albert Einstein, who was a great physicist. A physicist is someone who studies physics or the science that deals with energy or energy forms like heat and light. So Albert Einstein, the great physicist, had once replied, I don't need to remember certain things like the speed of sound because I could just look that up. But he was talking about looking up things in textbooks.
Yeah, and he, of course, was a genius. So if Albert Einstein said that, then it must be logical. He did not memorize the speed of sound. He probably did not memorize the speed of light. And, of course, if you're a physicist, you study physics. And that word is really difficult to pronounce, even for native speakers. Physicist. And yeah, he thought, I don't memorize that stuff because I can find that in textbooks. Nowadays, of course, we can find that information online. Indeed, remembering facts is seldom the most efficient use of memory. So true, we often hear this. We should be concentrating on accessing information or being able to find information, and we shouldn't focus so much on memorizing things, because if we memorize stuff, we're just going to forget it anyway. They always say that about people who cram for tests. They memorize all sorts of facts and figures and mathematical formulas, and they pretty much forget them about a year or two later.
Yes, if information is stored somewhere easily accessible, creating a memory of how to access it is far more efficient than memorizing the information itself. In other words, if information is stored or put in a place that you can get to easily, that is easily accessible, then it's better to create a memory of how you can get hold of that memory than to memorize that piece of information itself.
Exactly. So if I want to spell the word supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, well, I haven't memorized how to spell that word, but I know where I can find a dictionary online, and that is kind of memorizing something itself, remembering where that online dictionary is. I just go there, I look it up, or I try to look it up, and usually the computer has an algorithm that helps you find what you're looking for. There it is, and you can write the word yourself without having to memorize it. So yeah, I guess here it's saying that remembering where to find that information is just as good as actually memorizing that information itself.
Yes, and today the internet is the ultimate source of information, and thanks to search engines, it is extraordinarily simple to navigate. So in fact, today, if you're looking for a piece of information, you're going to use the internet. You're going to look up some website for the information that you want, and because we have search engines like Google, it becomes extraordinarily simple to navigate. So extraordinarily means in an extraordinary way. This is an adverb. So extraordinary means highly unusual or surprising. And the internet is extraordinarily or highly surprising or unusual to navigate. To navigate means to move between different parts. It could be a movement between different parts of a website or a movement from one website to another.
Right. You navigate the internet and you can navigate the ocean or an airplane. You can find your way from point A to point B. So it makes sense, therefore, that when we read something useful online, our brains tend to create the most efficient kind of memory about it. Not what it was, but how to access it. So again, we're actually using our brains to figure out how to find something. And of course, if we memorize something, that's probably not necessary because we've already memorized the way to find something and not the information itself. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's talk now about the third part. We'll listen first.
Generally speaking, this isn't a bad thing. Our brains are still making, retaining, and recalling memories in much the same way as they were before. They're just creating different kinds of records. And by using the internet as a kind of memory bank, we are vastly increasing the amount of information we can access. There is, however, one obvious disadvantage to being so dependent on the internet. In emergency situations, when there's simply no time for Googling, or, God forbid, no Wi-Fi, an unwelcome episode of digital amnesia will leave you very much in the lurch.
So in the second part, we talked about how we are using our memory not to retain or keep information, but more so to remember how to get to that information. And here it says, generally speaking, this isn't a bad thing. So the phrase generally speaking can mean, in other words, in general, this isn't a bad thing.
There are other ways to say speaking. You can say honestly speaking, frankly speaking, personally speaking, etc. They all have speaking in common, so it kind of depends on how you're summarizing some information. So here it begins by saying generally speaking, or you could just say generally, 一般来讲, this isn't a bad thing. Our brains are still making, retaining, and recalling memories in much the same way as they were before. They're just creating different kinds of records. So yeah, our brains are still working. We're not really lazy when we go online and depend on Google to find the information for us. Our brains are still working. They are retaining the information, which means you keep that information, you memorize it, and it stays there. You don't forget it. And then you recall the memories. You bring them back, and you're able to use that information again in a future context. And we do those the same way as if we were memorizing things. We're creating different kinds of records. So again, we're using our brains, but just in a different way.
Right. Aside from memories, you can also retain a skill. For instance, once you've learned how to ride a bicycle, that is a skill that you will retain for the rest of your life, as they say. And continuing on, it says here, and by using the internet as a kind of memory bank, we are vastly increasing the amount of information we can access.
Right. So a memory bank, of course, is where we store memories. And yes, indeed, the internet does act as a kind of memory bank. And it has vastly increasing amounts of information. Vast just means really, really huge, and add an ly there, and it becomes an adverb to modify the word increase. We are vastly increasing the amount of information we can access. There's all sorts of information on the internet. It's impossible to memorize it all. Therefore, we can just access that information and use different ways to get at that information, and our brains are still active in that way. There is, however, one obvious disadvantage to being so dependent on the internet. So, of course, when we talk about something, we talk about the pros and cons. We talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. A disadvantage, of course, is something that makes something bad. A reason why you may not choose that particular course of action.
Yeah, so I could say, for instance, one of the disadvantages of being short is that often when you go to concerts, you can't see the performers on stage.
That is a disadvantage indeed, but there are some advantages to being short. And we won't get into them right now here, but again, a disadvantage to not memorizing stuff is that you will be dependent on the internet. You will need it to work. If it doesn't work, if you've lost your connection, then you're in a pickle. And in emergency situations, when there's simply no time for Googling or, God forbid, no Wi-Fi, an unwelcome episode of digital amnesia will leave you very much in the lurch. That doesn't sound good. Of course, here we've got the phrase, God forbid. We say that when we want to say something just should not happen. And if it does happen, ooh, it's going to be really, really bad. So I should say that, hey, hurry home. God forbid you should be outside during a typhoon.
That's right. So let's say you're in a situation where there's no time for Googling, or even worse, there's no Wi-Fi, God forbid, then that could be a problem and leave you with an episode of digital amnesia. And then this will leave you in the lurch as well. When you are left in the lurch, it means that you are left in a situation that is very troublesome, that is very bad for you.
And I think most of us have been in such a situation before when suddenly, oh no, where's my internet signal? I can't go online. I feel totally naked. And that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. It's time now to turn things over to Hanny.
Hello, 各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。今天要练习文意选填的题型。我们先快速浏览题目的10个选项。A. Tend to 它可以表达照料照护。B. Available 是形容词，形容可取的可用的。C. Episode 它可以表达像是电视连续剧等等的一集，也可以表达一个事件插曲，还可以表达疾病的发作期。那么 D. Conducted 它可以是动词 conduct 的过去式或过去分词，用来表达进行实施。E. Ultimate 它可以形容是最基本的、最重要的，或者是终极的、最终的，那它是形容词。F. Cause 它可以当名词表示原因、理由，或是当动词来表达造成、导致。G. Stored 它可以是动词 store 的过去式或过去分词，那么 store 它就有这种储存的意思。那么 H. Rely on 是依赖、仰赖。I. Dependent 它是形容词，形容依赖的。那么 J. Phenomenon 它表示现象，那要特别注意这个字是单数，它的复数形呢是把字尾 on 改成 a 变成 phenomenon， 所以特别注意它是单数名词哦。好，那我们接着就来做题目咯。来看到第一题，这边空格它前后是写说 You've experienced the 空格 known as the Google effect。那空格前面有定冠词 the， 然后后面是分词片语 known as the Google effect。我们可以知道空格应该是要填入一个名词，符合的选项有 C. episode、F. cause、J. phenomenon。那被称为 Google 效应的应该会是一个现象，所以最适合答案选 J. phenomenon。好，那么第二个空格则是出现在一个关系子句里，它写到说 which derives from a study 空格in 2011。 好，那其中的 which derives from a study 它已经是一个完整的子句了，因此推测空格里面是要填入修饰语来修饰前方的 a study 是在2011年怎么样怎么样。我们这边可以用到形容词，或者是以过去分词当形容词去修饰。那符合条件的选项有 B. available、 D. conducted、 E. ultimate、 G. stored、 I. dependent。那么根据句意呢，最符合的应该是 D. conducted。 我们用 a study conducted in 2011 是表达说2011年进行的一项研究，这时候 conducted 前面就是省略了 which was。 好，再看到第三个空格，这边前后他说 as we increasingly 空格 the internet for information 点点点，那么空格前面有主词 we， 还有副词 increasingly，后面则有名词 the internet。 我们可以知道空格是要填入有及物用法的复数动词，或者是可能是要填入片语动词，而时态是用现在式。符合的选项有 A. tend to、 F. cause、 H. rely on。 那根据语义，答案应该要选 H. rely on 去表达说我们越来越仰赖网络。再看到第四题，他说什么什么 a significant 空格 for concern。好，空格前面有不定冠词 a， 还有形容词 significant， 后面则是有 for concern。我们这边可以知道说，空格应该要填入单数可数名词。那符合选项的有 C episode， 还有 F cause。那根据语义，应该是要选 F cause。A significant cause for concern 就是表达一个值得关注的重要原因。我们再看到第5题，他说什么什么 because it was readily 空格 in textbooks。空格呢，就是在这个 because 引导的子句里面，而空格前面有主词 it， 动词 was， 还有副词 readily， 然后后面则是接 in textbooks。我们可以判断空格里面应该是要填入形容词，或者是填入分词。那符合的选项有 B available、E ultimate、G stored， 还有 I dependent。那根据语义呢，应该是要选 be available， 用来表达说很容易就能在教科书上找到。好，再看到第6题，他说 If information is 空格 somewhere easily accessible。空格的前面我们看到有主词 information， 还有动词 is， 然后空格后面则是副词 somewhere。这边可以推测应该要填入分词，用来表达说如果资讯被怎么样怎么样在容易取得的地方。好，那符合的选项只剩下 G stored 去表达储存的意思。好，那么第7题他说 Today the internet is the空格 source of information。 好，空格前面有定冠词 the， 后面则有名词 source， 我们可以推测空格是要填入形容词哦。符合的选项有 E ultimate， 还有 I dependent。那根据语义应该是要选 E，the ultimate source of information 可以表达出资讯最重要的来源怎么样怎么样。再看到第8题，他说 Our brains空格 create the most efficient kind of memory about it。 空格前面有主词 our brains， 后面则是原形动词 create。 那这边可以推断说空格呢是要填入副词来当修饰，或者是你是要填入一个后方它可以接原形动词的选项。那这边符合的就只有 A tend to， 我们用 tend to 加上原形动词可以表达往往会怎么样。好，再来看到第9题，他说being so 怎么样on the internet。 空格前面有 be 动词，还有副词 so， 空格后面则是介系词片语 on the internet。 这边可以推测空格是要填入形容词或分词，那剩下的选项就只有 I dependent 符合了。好，我们看到第10题，他说 An unwelcome 空格 of digital amnesia will 怎么样怎么样。空格前面它有不定冠词 an， 还有形容词 unwelcome， 后面则是 of digital amnesia。 可以知道说空格应该要填入单数可数名词。那符合的选项只剩下 C episode， 而且它有符合语义，所以我们答案就是选这个 C episode。 好，以上是今天的讲解，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Derive. Many of the author's stories derive from popular folk tales. Tendency. The economist discussed the tendency of wealth to collect in the hands of a few. Physicist. Peter's daughter studied hard to become a physicist. Extraordinarily. Harry came up with an extraordinarily simple solution to the problem. Retain. I haven't retained much of what I learned in college. Vastly. Working fewer hours would vastly improve Evan's quality of life. Disadvantage. There are several significant disadvantages to the plan you proposed.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.